Welcome everyone. My name is Holly Stoneberg and I'm the Education Program Coordinator for Portage Park District. And I'm really excited to talk with you about wetlands and watersheds tonight. You know Portage County is home to a bunch of them, so let's get going. We're going to start with our mission like we always do, but the mission of Portage Park District is to conserve Portage County's natural heritage and provide opportunities for its appreciation and enjoyment. And I feel like when we're talking about wetlands and watersheds, this hits close to home, especially with this topic, right? You may be seeing signs going up around by our preserves that's saying that like we're protecting our wetlands and watersheds, because by putting parks there, we're minimizing the impact of development on those lands, and we're continuing to conserve them not only for us to enjoy them, but also for the organisms that call it home. So I feel like on this topic, the mission is really, really pertinent. All right, let's start with the basics. What is a watershed? So if we start with a very basic definition, it's an area of land that drains to a specific body of water. So as an example, let's just look at the Cuyahoga River watershed, which is one that we're probably all familiar with. So if you look here in blue, we have not only the Cuyahoga River, but the main tributaries that lead into it. So all the bodies of water that are going into the Cuyahoga. And if you look at that lighter yellow shaded path, that's the Cuyahoga River watershed. So all the precipitation that falls on the land there that isn't absorbed by a plant or by an organism, right? It's going to eventually lead to one of these bodies of water and then out to Lake Erie. So that's what a watershed is. It's all of that land, right? And every single one of us is in a watershed. So it doesn't matter where you are at every single point in time that you're on Earth, you're in a watershed. Let's go over the parts of it a little bit. So here's a very basic diagram of one. If you look up at the top, there's those tributaries again, which are just smaller bodies of water that lead into a main one. And as they go through, you can see that they pass through a bunch of stuff, right? We see lakes on the side, we see wetlands, and you also see a riparian zone. If you're not familiar with that term, it's just kind of the buffer zone between the body of water and the rest of the land. I guess it's easiest to imagine if you're walking along a river, you have the river and then the whole side of the river before you get to the rest of the surrounding area. That's our riparian zone. But the other thing I want to point out is that you can see like the towns and this little, it looks like an industry down at the bottom left. Those are also in our wetlands, along with all the other things that humans manage to build in between here and there. So yes, it has all these wetlands and lakes, but wherever humans are, whatever the impact is, that's also in the wetland. So whenever the water is traveling over it, it's going to pick up whatever is on the land. So that's something we have to be cognizant of all the time, because that water, it's going to flow, right? And we kind of determine what it's going to flow over. The other two things I wanted to point out is that if you see here on the bottom left, like we have our percolation into the ground and then the groundwater, right? As the water is flowing over this land, some of it does get absorbed into the land, and a lot of humans get their water from groundwater. And that goes back to the point of saying, if the water is traveling over toxins or pollutants and then eventually get into our groundwater, it's going to come back to haunt us eventually, right? We may not notice it right now, but eventually it'll be in the groundwater that we're using for drinking and other things. The other thing that I wanted to point out is the divide, right? You can see on the left-hand side, there's a ridge, and on the right-hand side, it says the watershed divide. Those are essentially the same thing. So we know at the top of high points, there's a point, right? And we know, everybody knows, water runs downhill. So when you hit that ridge, wherever the water falls, if it's a little bit to the left of this watershed divide, it's going to go into this one that we're visualizing here, this little river or stream that's happening. But if it falls a little bit to the right, we can see it's going to go into a different watershed. So it all depends on how the land lays, and that's going to determine where the water is going. So one thing that wasn't on the image that is pretty important is the headwaters. And this is just the highest point in the watershed where water begins its journey. And watersheds, it can have many headwater streams. They can be wide, or some of them can even be a couple inches wide. So they don't have to be very thick. Hopefully you recognize this picture if you do travel on our similarly or named Headwaters Trail. Right, if you've ever passed on this, If you enjoy biking or running or walking your dog, whatever you want, the Headwaters Trail is great for all of those things. But my favorite part of it is the fact that it does cross over a continental watershed divide. So I took these pictures from Lime Ridge Road, and if you look at the picture that's leading to Manaway, the water, when it rains, if it's on that side, it's going to flow to the Cuyahoga River, out to Lake Erie, and then eventually it's going to make its way all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. If you just stand on Lime Ridge and turn your head and look to the way that's facing Garrettsville, that water, when it rains, is going to flow to the Mahoning River, down to the Ohio River, and eventually out to the Gulf of Mexico. So you can stand on Lime Ridge Road and know exactly where the water is going, depending on which way you're looking down the Headwaters Trail. So that's a really cool thing to do. So try to get out there during a heavy rainfall and look which way the water's going. But do be careful, there's not a parking lot there, so protect yourself. One great thing about Portage County is that we actually have 5 watersheds, which is relatively high for a single county, but it's really exciting for us because, like I just said, we have these divides around and we love watersheds and watershed health. So it's fun for us to talk about. If you look up on the top left around Aurora, that's the Chagrin River. This big chunk is the one we've been talking about. This kind of green yellowish is the Cuyahoga River. The top right corner is kind of small, but the Grand River is included there. This other large chunk of the county is the Mahoning River. That's the one that's going to lead to the Ohio and then down out the Mississippi. And this bottom left corner is the Tuscarawas River. So we're really lucky to have 5 different watersheds just in one county to learn about, to study. So if we talk about the area that a watershed contains, if we're talking about the Cuyahoga River, the one we talked about in the beginning, it drains 813 square miles of land, right? So the next one is going to be the Ohio River watershed. So now that we know that the chat is enabled, I want you to go put your guesses in there. What is the square mileage that the Ohio River is going to drain to? How big is that Ohio River watershed? Go ahead and throw your guesses into the chat box. Anybody feeling brave? I know you probably weren't anticipating having an interactive webinar, but we thought we'd give it a go. Anybody want to try? Okay. I guess not. That's okay. I'll give you spoiler alert. Here's the, oh, thank you, Mary Jo. 1200. I like it. Thank you for playing along. Well, if Mary Jo is the only guess, then she wins, right? If we look here, the Ohio River actually drains 204,000 square miles, so it's huge. Remember, the Ohio River isn't just in Ohio, even though we do like to claim it, but it does travel all the way down past these other states. And eventually it's going to lead into the Mississippi River watershed. Mary Jo or anyone else, are you feeling like you want to give it a guess? How big the Mississippi River watershed is? Knowing that just the Ohio River on this part is 204,000 square miles. A million? It's a good guess. Thank you, Erin. 10 seconds for anybody else. No. All right, looks like Erin wins this one. Yeah, you're really close. 1.2 million square miles. So the Mississippi River watershed is huge. It goes all the way out to the Rockies, all the way down the Appalachians, and then down out into the Gulf of Mexico, right? So all of this water, including the Ohio, right? So the Ohio is technically considered part of the Mississippi River watershed. It's just broken down even smaller. So this is massive. So everybody, every single human on this land is contributing to the watershed health that's leading out the Gulf of Mexico, right? So it's really important for humans to be aware of their impact because it doesn't just affect us or us personally. So you might be saying, oh, that's all fine and dandy, but I don't actually know which watershed I'm living in. Conveniently, the EPA has that figured out for us. So if you want to go ahead, and I think you can copy that right up there, but it's just mywaterway.epa.gov. You can go in, and I think I've got it specific enough that you can just go to the top part where it says, let's get started. And it says 705 Oakwood Street, Ravenna Road. That's the example I put in for us. So if you're familiar with Portage Park District, that's our home office there in Ravenna. And I put in our address, and right away it popped out that we are up here. Can you see that up in the corner? Watershed, a feeder canal of Breakneck Creek. So Breakneck Creek is part of the Cuyahoga River watershed. It's actually the second largest tributary of the watershed. I just learned this from Jen. Second only to Tinker's Creek, right? So all of the water there is going to feed into Breakneck Creek, which will lead to the Cuyahoga River, and then go up to the lake, to Lake Erie. I think it's funny because I live a 7-minute drive from the office, and I'm in the Mahoning River watershed, which will lead out to the Gulf of Mexico. So these lines they're pretty well distributed all through Portage County. So I encourage you to go and find out which watershed you're in. Okay, to go along with that, watersheds, we're also going to talk about wetlands, right? So our wetlands are important because, like everything else, they're located within watersheds, but they're a little bit easier for us to comprehend, right? Because we can see them and we see the actual wetland. But in order to define a wetland, we need these 3 pieces of information. So wetlands have to have plants that like their feet wet, right? So these are plants that are adapted to wet environments for either all or most of the year. So not arid plants. We're not going to see any cacti in here. Plants that like having wet roots. Another point is that the soil is anoxic, or it's lacking oxygen. And that's because when you're talking about saturated land, usually on normal ground, there's pore space containing oxygen or air. But if the ground is saturated, then that pore space can no longer fit the air because it's all full of water. And because there's no oxygen, then decomposition takes a really, really long time because you don't have that the ability to break down as quickly. And since you can't break down as quickly, it's like this big chain of events, right? Since you can't break down as quickly, then you have this carbon-rich organic matter here. So wetlands are wonderful for all the plant life that they support. And then the third thing is that there has to be water at or near the surface during some part of the year. So it does not have to be wet the entire year round, but it does have to sustain water at some point during the year. Hopefully you recognize this picture. It's one of my favorite places in the park. Excuse me. If you go to Dick's Park and walk all the way to the back and then turn to the left on the Trillium Trail, as you continue down, you'll get to this little footbridge that passes over kind of a mucky spot. And if you look out, you see this wetland here. And these plants are mature swamp cabbage. So that's just another one of our plants. It's a native flowering plant in Ohio. It's actually the first plant that's going to flower in the spring. And when you look here, it's one of my favorite views because these get so big and lush and green. It just looks like something out of Jurassic Park. So there's a wetland that you can go visit right there in Ravenna. Okay, so let's talk about the variety of wetlands that you might encounter when you're looking at these things. My favorite one is a vernal pond because I love frogs, right? So I've become very fond of these vernal ponds. But vernal ponds are depressions in the land that either fill up with rainwater or snow melt, and they're not deep enough to support fish life, which makes them really good nurseries for our frogs. So if you have a wetland on or near your property, you're going to hear lots of frogs or toads in the spring and now even throughout the summer because they're able to lay their eggs in there and not worry about them being hunted by the fish that would be there. They still have to worry about birds and all those other things that would visit a wetland, but not so much the fish. So what else do we have? So bogs and fens, if you're not familiar with the difference between those, they're both created by the glaciers retreating thousands of years ago, but the difference is the way that the water gets to them. So if it's a fen, then their water comes from groundwater, and if it's a bog, it's usually rainwater. So that's the only real difference. And then because of that, it's going to change the type of vegetation that it has. With marshes and swamps, marshes are more near rivers and lakes, and they're often covered by water, but they don't have to be continuously covered by water, whereas swamps are covered with water all year round, right? And because of that, their plants have to be really well adapted to having wet feet. So you're going to find trees that really like wet grounds. Excuse me. And then some of our other things, right? It doesn't have to be a formal pond or bog, right? It could just be a ditch somewhere that matches all of those things, having plants that like it wet, having anoxic soil, and excuse me, and having water at some point of the year. Ditches fall into that category. So you might have a wetland right at the end of your driveway, right? And then there's lots of other ones that we could talk about. But let's focus on their importance today. So, I mean, we can go about the importance of wetlands forever, and I'm sure you all have your own list as well. But these are the big ones that we always talk about. So it's a great habitat, right? So you probably recognize that guy from the back. Whenever you go to a wetland, you're bound to see a great blue heron hanging around. If you go out early enough and maybe you're in your kayak, I usually tend to annoy them because they're hunting for their breakfast and they squawk at me and fly away. So I love seeing them though. But they offer habitat to all different kinds of organisms, right? Not just the birds, but all the things that the birds would live on. So the fish and the frogs and the snakes and everything that would live in the water and everything they would live on. So the food chain just continues in both directions, right? You have the small microorganisms that would be in the water, like the zooplankton, and then all the way up to the big birds and the macroorganisms. Another reason they're important is because of storage. So when we talk about wetlands, they act like a sponge. Okay, so during heavy rain events, like I'm sure you're all aware, we've been having a lot of recently, the wetlands are a place that the water can go and reduce flooding. Okay, so if we get rid of our wetlands and pave it over with concrete, now we've taken a pervious solution and replaced it with an impervious solution, but the water still has to go somewhere, right? So if the ground is now impervious, that water is going to flow and eventually flood somewhere else. But if we keep it a wetland, it acts as a sponge and sucks up all that water, and it actually minimizes the risk of flooding because the water now has somewhere to go. To go along with that, it's also a filter. So during these rain events, as water goes through these wetlands, they're going to filter out the pollutants and the solids and all the things that come with the water. Like all things, they have a limit, right? They can't take an endless supply of pollution, which is why we have to stop it at the source. But they do a good job of filtering out the things that make the water not so hospitable before it moves on to its next place. Another reason to go back to the birds, it's a resting place. We have a lot of migratory birds that are going to fly over, especially now we're getting into the fall migration season, but wetlands provides a really great place for them to rest and kind of catch their breath before they continue on that really long journey. And then in the spring, when they come back, it does the same thing, but now for their babies. So they have this nursery where, yeah, there are predators, but the wetland has everything that an organism needs. It has that food, but it also provides really great shelter and hiding places so that those baby organisms have a chance to survive. A food source, not only for the animals like we just talked about, right? That whole trophic level, all the trophic levels are there, but also for us. We know rice is grown in saturated lands, okay? And then they're just beautiful. So just one of those things. There's all these studies that say you're looking at water each day reduces anxiety and helps with depression. So there's just that beauty factor to it too. So all of these reasons are why we need to protect them. So how can you help? Minimize your chemical use is probably the most obvious one, right? Whenever we use pesticides or herbicides or fertilizers, they don't just stay where we put them, right? The rain is going to come or you're going to water your yard and it's going to filter out and move on. And just because you know where your property lines are doesn't mean that the water does. So as it continues on, it's going to move and it's going to accumulate. And yes, those wetlands are great places to filter them out, but they can only take so much. Okay? So just be really judicious with what you're doing on your property. Properly dispose of waste. So we can be really general here. It can be litter, right? And I know I'm preaching to the choir here. I know you all know not to litter, but other things that we might not think about, like dog waste, right? All of the things that are in that are going to go into our waterways. And this picture I have here, right? There's still people that do oil changes at home, and they don't take the dirty oil that comes out the bottom to the proper disposal sites. They just dump it out right in the yard, right? And they might think that, yeah, it's my yard, I can do what I want. But again, that oil isn't going to stay there, right? So our yards aren't dumping zones. And a lot of places now have free collection sites for those things. So I know it's an extra step, but it's one more thing to protect our water. And then another option is to provide or to install a rain barrel or a rain garden. So I just installed a rain garden, and I'm sure, as you can predict, it is full of water right now. But the whole point of this is to reduce the load. If you live in the city and have sewer water, this is going to collect it and not put as much of a load on those sewer systems. Or if you live like where I live and I just have well water and septic, it catches the water so that I don't have so much standing water around. So this acts as a filter. It dries out the rest of the yard so you don't have as many wet spots, and you can plant it with native pollinator plants so it's beautiful and you get other critters that come around as well. And then a rain garden is helpful because now you don't have to draw on your own water as much. You can just use the rain that's already falling. Another way to get involved and do some science is to become a citizen scientist. If you're not familiar with that, these are for people who may or may not have a scientific background. And one that we've partnered with is Akron Watershed Hydro Watch. And we actually have 2 postings, one at Red Fox Water Trail Access, which is a part of Portage Park District. And then there's another one at Booker Memorial Park in Manaway. So that's not part of Portage Park District, but it's right there on the Headwaters Trail. So it's easy to get to from our properties. And I really like this one specifically because you don't need anything high tech. Their setup is relatively low tech. If you look at this picture here, they have this sign here that gives you step-by-step instructions. And then if you look down to the left in the water, that pole right there has a ruler on it. And that's it. And then as far as you doing the science, you don't need to download an app or do anything fancy. All you do is text your reading to that number and you'll get a reply that says, "Thank you for contributing." So what they're doing specifically is collecting water level data, and then they use that to monitor stream health. So after these big rain events, they can see where the water level is, and then that can help along with some other tests that they run, determine the sediments in there, the possible pollutants, the flow that's going on. So I encourage you all to go try that. They love data, as all scientists do, and it really helps getting people out there. So whenever you're at Red Fox or at Booker Memorial, so just go ahead and send them a text, please. And then if you want to know more about your land, we also have this website called modelmywatershed.org. And this goes back to helping you study your specific one. So remember at the beginning, we talked about now you can know what your watershed is. Here you can look at your land and what's going to happen after a rain event. So you go on this website and you find your place on the map. And I found it easiest to use the draw button, and I drew a very rough square around a piece of property, and then you hit select model and then site storm model. So you can see after these big rain events that we've been having, what's going to happen. So it says here 24-hour hypothetical storm event, the level, and if you look at the colors, right, a majority of it is going to be infiltrated into the ground. Some of it in red is going to be runoff, and then the rest is going to be evapotranspiration. So that's transpiration from plants, right? So when I selected this, the soil here is mostly clay and it's covered in plants. So it's good to know that even though clay is really slow at absorbing, it is pervious, and that's better than having a lot of concrete around, right, to let it run off. So you can go and see what's happening on your property right after these rain events we've been having. Okay. So that was short and sweet, but we've come to the end of our presentation for tonight. Hopefully, if you didn't already know what a watershed is, now you do. And I really hope you go and find out what your watershed is. And then I encourage us all to do our part to protect these wetlands and watersheds. If you have any questions, my email's there, Becca's email's there, and then all of the ways you can reach us.